All right, so a couple things off the top. We go to Canvas. So you've got that third assignment that's due at the end of the day today. So hopefully put some time into that already. We'll have that other assignment that's due at the end of the next week, which will be kind of going over some of the stuff that we'll talk about today, as well as some of the stuff early next week. I'm hoping that Friday we kind of have as an exam review, and then I'm going to push the exam date forward to November 7th, which is a Monday. So I'll put that announcement up on Canvas. I also put up under this practice problems, I have kind of the old set, which is the third one, which goes up to kind of like monopolies. And then here's the fourth one, which will be kind of what we cover today as well as early next week. Okay. So it's going to be all pretty closely related to monopolies and kind of what we did before. We're just adding a little bit of different wrinkles into it. You good? Okay. So where did we leave off? Okay. So we left off kind of talking about monopolies, looking at natural monopolies, price discrimination. We're going to kind of move to the next type of market. So we have up to this point a perfectly competitive as well as a monopoly in terms of the two markets that we've looked at. In between those, right, those are like the two biggest extremes. Monopolies, there's one firm with all the power. Perfectly competitive, we said nobody has power. There's a ton of firms, right? So there's a lot of competition going on. I can't kind of deviate from the price at all. So in between those, right, we've got kind of two other main types of models that we'll look at. Now, if you like going to continue, if you've already become major, or you take other econ courses, you might find like we can break these up into several different types of oligopolies. But for us, we'll just kind of look at kind of the main two models here. So we've got an oligopoly and monopolistic and competitive markets. These will be look pretty similar to what we've done before. The oligopoly markets might look a little bit different. Okay. So today, we're going to go over those monopolistically competitive markets using a lot of what we know from perfectly competitive and monopolistic markets, right? It's like we're combining the two. Okay? And then, like I said, Monday and Wednesday next week, we'll kind of deal with some oligopoly issues and then do some review on Friday. Okay? So what are some characteristics of monopolistically competitive markets? Right? Well, like perfectly competitive markets, we're going to have a lot of sellers. Firms are going to be able to enter and exit freely, right? So there's no kind of like regulations from the government or something that's kind of forcing us to only have like one or two firms. The key difference between a perfectly competitive market and a monopolistically competitive market, also I will stumble over that word quite a bit, so I apologize already, but the key difference there is that when we had a perfectly competitive market, we were assuming that the product was exactly the same. So we were thinking about things like gasoline, bottled water, exact perfect substitutes. So this isn't something we generally observe because even with things like that, certain people prefer, I don't know, Aquafina to Dasani, right? So there's some type of brand loyalty that differentiates the products a little bit. But knowing what we know about the perfect competitive market, we now add in this wrinkle, which is, okay, these goods are very similar, but they're a little bit different, right? The products are a little bit differentiated, even if it's only by their brand, okay? So if that's the case, like kind of make, we think about fast food, apartments, they're all kind of very similar, right? You're still trying to find a place to live, it's just they might vary a little bit by the amenities or kind of the characteristics. So here's just kind of a nice little chart that kind of, labels this good summary, this chart kind of go back to that fourth homework assignment that's due next week. It's a lot easier. I'll tell you right now, there's a lot more of like a multiple choice and like kind of fill in. So if you want to breeze through it, you can. I would highly suggest like, yeah, see what you need to do to get all the points, but it's also a really good study tool, right? So some of the questions might be really easy if you can kind of go through it mindlessly because you can just kind of keep clicking on the next answer. But I would really, I would strongly suggest like really focus on why the correct answer is what it is. So even if you're just kind of guessing to get there, make sure you understand why that correct answer is correct. But this might be helpful for some of those problems, right? So monopolies with one seller, they had the only product, or they had a product that had no substitutes. There might be barriers to entry, perfectly competitive, same product, free entry and exit, a lot of sellers. Competitive, you got a lot of sellers, free entry and exit. but their product is a little bit differentiated, right? So they have a little bit of market power, right? You kind of think about it, if you want to buy Pepsi, if you're interested in buying, some type of pop and you really just want Pepsi, well, they have a little bit of a monopoly on producing Pepsi, right? So if you're really loyal to a brand, that gives that company a little bit of market power. So the monopolistic competitive firm follows everything that the other two firms are doing when it comes to choosing that profit maximizing quantity. We said the profit maximizing quantity for the firm, and it doesn't matter if we're looking at a monopolist or a perfectly competitive market, was the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right? The difference was when we had a perfectly competitive market, we said marginal revenue was just the equilibrium price. But for a monopolist, they kind of face this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So monopolistic competitive markets are going to use that same profit maximizing decision, but we're going to end up with, they have a little bit of market power. So they're going to have a portion of the demand curve. So they're going to end up with a twice as steep marginal revenue curve as well. Okay. So it's going to look kind of similar to a monopolist, but I'll kind of make there'll be some key differences that we'll get to in terms of what the long run profits look like in a monopolistic competitive market relative to a monopoly. Okay. So in the short run, and here, over here, I would think about drawing this over here. So or look at it in the slides, and you want to kind of build it a little bit more. It was like, I don't know, it was like forward a little bit more. So we're thinking about a monopolistic competitive firm. They're going to face a demand curve. Now, I'm trying to draw this on purpose to be not quite as steep as the demand curves that I was drawing from monopolies. So the reason why, you kind of think about it as demand gets more and more horizontal, are we getting kind of more or less elastic? Well, there I can think about even small price changes might cause me to have large quantity jumps. So we're thinking about, because it's differentiated products, it's not the only product, there are substitutes. If I raise the price of Pepsi up enough, a lot of people are going to substitute away and buy Coke. So if I just have differentiated products, especially by brand names, people are pretty elastic, right? The price changes. I can get away with charging a little bit more for Pepsi for people who like it. Right? But if I go too high, I'm going to start losing my consumer. So we kind of think about for monopolistic competitive markets, the demand curve is a little flatter. Now they're still going to face these increasing marginal costs. So before I add in the average total cost curve, where would the profit maximizing quantity be? Just like the monopolist, it was very similar. Where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? This is the quantity the firm would choose. What price would they charge? Well, just like the monopolist, at this quantity, we know people are willing to pay up to their marginal benefit. So the price that we can get away with charging, and actually if I want to set a firm here, I'll use MC to kind of represent it's a monopolistic competitive firm, or a firm in a monopolistic competitive market. So it looks pretty similar to what we were doing with monopolies in terms of choosing the optimal quantity and then determining what's the kind of price you can do away with charge the consumers at that quantity. Questions over it should look similar. We kind of use a similar model. Now let's assume we throw in their average total cost curve. Okay. So I've got their average total cost curve of this monopolistic competitive firm. What would profits be? Well, profits are always going to be the quantity we sell. The quantity we sell times like the per unit profit we're making. Well, what's the per unit profit? Whatever price we're selling our product for, minus our average costs, right? Our average unit costs. So price minus average total cost kind of represented our per unit profits. So if I take on average how much I'm making for each unit I sell times the number of units I sell, that's how much profit I make.
Question.
Yeah.
What's the difference between, and I know this is probably a basic question, but what's the difference between average total cost and marginal cost? How does that affect the product and profit?
Yeah, so remember, we said that marginal costs were the change in total costs from whatever our change in production was. So it was like, if I want to get these extra 10 units, how much are my costs going up by? Okay. Our average total costs was, we'll take our total costs and divide it by how much we're producing. So average total cost is like how much your costs are being spread out over each unit. So if I've got 1,000 is my total cost and I'm producing 10 units, each unit is costing me $100 on average. Now the marginal cost tells me that that first unit produced probably doesn't add a total or add to the total cost 100. It probably only adds maybe 20. And that when I get up to this quantity, maybe it's adding 200. But the average total cost is kind of giving me like the average marginal cost, right? The average kind of across all the units I'm selling, what was kind of like my average marginal cost? Marginal cost is telling you specifically, this unit cost me this much, this unit cost me this. Does that help a little bit? Any other questions? So at that profit maximizing quantity, what are profits? Will identify where I'm at in my average total cost curve. This rectangle would represent profits. Why? Because what is the base of that rectangle? It's going from 0 to whatever the optimal quantity is. What's the height? Well, that's just the difference between the price and the average total cost. So we had grid lines here with some actual values. We just plugging those numbers into that formula and then calculate what profits would be. So once again, up to this point, no different than what a monopolist is doing, right? And how we determine monopolist profits. But what's going to happen? So I think I had one. Yeah, there we go. So we find the price. We've got positive profits. What's going to happen if firms can enter and exit this market at will if there's currently positive profits here? Negative eventually, so it's positive now. So what happens to the number of firms? Goes up. So this is where it gets a little bit different because before, when the number of firms went up, that affected the equilibrium price, which is what I had to sell my product. Right? Problem is, I don't have to take the equilibrium price as given. So it's going to work a little bit differently, but the long run implication, I think someone said it or at least alluded to it, profits will eventually go to 0. Right? In the long run, firms will enter this market, profits will get driven down to 0. But how does that happen? So it doesn't operate through changing the equilibrium price. It operates by, I can kind of think about each firm in a monopolistically competitive market. Their demand, although it might be a little different for Coke and Pepsi, they are still a function of whatever the general demand for pop is, right? Or Coke or whatever you call it, right? So their demand curve, you can think about it as it's like a fraction of the overall demand curve. So let's say I had 2 firms and they were evenly splitting that demand. When a third firm enters, because they see the current 2 firms making profit, what's going to be true about the demand curve each of those 3 firms now face? Well, they're not going to have half of overall demand, which assume that they're evenly splitting. They're only going to have a third. So what's that going to do to my demand curve? It's going to decrease it. Try to draw this a little bit. Exactly. So I want zero profits. So we're going to say the demand curve goes down. And this could be somewhere up here. This is like my new demand curve after that firm enters. Here's my new marginal revenue curve. The new quantity that a firm is going to choose, right? It's going to be a little bit lower than it was before because there's now 3 firms that are splitting demand. And then the price they can get over charging, notice it's on my average total cost curve, right? So I think probably a clearer version of this, right? It could be that if a third firm enters, well, maybe now it pushes demand down enough to where I have negative profits, right? Which if that's the case, firms would exit. But in the long run, let's see that here. In the long run, the scenario that we'll have is that the demand curve for each firm's product ends up being exactly on its average total cost. So in the short run, we might have positive, we might have negative profits. As firms enter or exit, it shifts that demand curve up or down until in the long run, we get this profit maximizing quantity where price that we're charging is exactly equal to average total cost because the profits are zero. Right? So the result is the same as a perfectly competitive market. It's just that it operates a little bit differently, right? And to be completely honest, if we saw a market that's more monopolistic competitive, it's going to probably take longer to get to the long run. Like I said, the long run is kind of this philosophical idea that we're always kind of moving towards it. With these monopolistic competitive markets, we quite often see that, firms are entering and exiting, and there are, short run profits and sometimes short term losses, depending on how many firms are entering or exiting. But it really kind of works, like I said, very similar to a monopolist, right? It's just that there are long run profits, and monopolists could have positive long run profits. Here, we have a monopolistic competitive market, there are long run profits get driven down to zero. Let me go back here. I just wanted to kind of jump ahead a little bit. So, this is just another scenario where if demand was too low, profit maximizing quantity, price I can get away with charging is below my average total cost, I'd have a negative profit. Very similar to what we were doing before. So let's kind of try to think about some of this. Kind of think about this one first, and I might have you guys go over one. So, which of the following is going to be true about a monopolistic competitive market? So let's just go through each one. Okay, so it results in higher prices than a monopoly. So I'd have to kind of overlay a monopolistic competitive market with a pure monopoly. So I can kind of try to give you some insight into this. But let's say I had a monopolist. They're going to face the entire demand curve, right? So you kind of think about it as here's the overall demand curve, and they're going to be making their decisions based off of that. Let's assume for a second that both of them, a market that was monopolized and one that was monopolistically competitive. Let's assume that the firms have the exact same marginal costs and the exact same average total costs. Right? What I can kind of show here is, here's the monopolist's profit maximizing quantity. Here's the price they can get away with charging. Significantly above average total cost, they're going to have some pretty large profits. Right? So if I have a monopolistic competitive firm, they aren't going to face all of demand. We'll just start out with an initial. What if they're like getting a third of demand? Well, they're not facing the entire demand curve now. They're going to be facing something much lower. So here, if they had the same costs as the monopolist, if it was a monopolistic competitive market, you can kind of see that. And I should have added sorry, I wrote price here. Price of the monopolist. So you can kind of see here, well, maybe that monopolistic competitive market, it's going to be a much lower price than if this market was a monopolist, right? And kind of the result is, for the reasoning why, because that monopolist faces the entirety of demand, right? Whereas this firm is kind of splitting it with other firms in the industry. So it's not going to result in higher prices than a monopolist, right? It's going to result in higher prices than a perfectly competitive market. So we can see if that one's true by thinking about, okay, if I had this market that was monopolistically competitive, you think about they're going to face marginal demand, here's marginal revenue, marginal costs. Excuse me. So where's the profit maximizing quantity? The monopolistic competitive market, or marginal revenues equal marginal costs. They can get away with charging this higher price. So the perfectly competitive outcome, it's a little bit harder to think about here, but we said when a market is perfectly competitive, it would be the point where supply is equal to demand. So I actually can think about a scenario where we'll assume that every firm is kind of getting an equal portion of demand. And then, we add it up, they have all that the same marginal cost. So we could really just look at one of these firms to determine where would their quantity be if it's a perfectly competitive market. We can kind of think about supply represents marginal cost. So if it was a perfectly competitive market, that equilibrium quantity or the perfectly competitive quantity would be a little bit higher. And the price would be a little bit lower. Right? So it results in higher prices in a perfectly competitive market? Yes. So we already have our answer, it's B, but it results in a lower quantity than a monopolist. We kind of already showed that one here. That this is how much each firm is making, but I would then have to multiply that by the number of firms that there were. So what ends up being true is that we actually have a higher quantity with monopolistically competitive firms. I was just drawing out kind of comparing one firm, like this was just one of many. So I'd actually take that quantity and multiply it by the number of firms. What we end up with is that we actually end up with a higher quantity from a monopolistic competitive market, right? Because the firms don't have as much power. They don't have as much power to restrict that quantity. And then it's more economically efficient than a perfectly competitive market. Just for like a general rule of thumb, a perfectly competitive market we said was allocatively efficient. It's the most efficient market we can ever have. So every other type of market we talk about is always going to be less efficient than a perfectly competitive market, right? Kind of think about here. What tells us that we're not as efficient as we could be? I'm losing out on all this surplus from these units I'm no longer selling, right? So any market that we look at that's not perfectly competitive, perfectly competitive markets maximize total surplus. So they're the most efficient, no other market will be as efficient. Not as, because I'm just trying to kind of give some ideas here. I probably wouldn't ask a question this maybe on the exam. But the idea is that as I'm moving between a perfectly competitive and a monopolistic market, the closer I get to a monopoly, the higher the price and the more the output's going to be restricted. Which also means that as I get closer and closer to a monopoly, right, or monopoly power, I'm also getting larger and larger deadweight loss. So maybe one way to think about this, I was going to give kind of a synopsis, or sort of a general way to think about the markets is we've got a monopoly and perfectly competitive market. And then we're kind of like moving in between the two, right? Monopolistic competitive markets are somewhere in the middle there, right? So let's say that these brands or these differentiated products start to become more and more differentiated, right? So each company has a little bit more and more power. We're getting kind of closer to a monopoly than we are to a perfectly competitive market. What's going to be true, I'm trying to think about this is like, in a perfectly competitive market, the price gets driven down to this lowest point possible. And then for a monopolist, they're charging a much higher price, right? So if I'm thinking about values here to help make sense, maybe it's something like this. So as the market becomes more and more monopolized or firms gain more and more power, I'm moving from a lower to a higher price, right? So like if I had to put like a monopolistically competitive market here, maybe the price is 15. Higher than perfectly competitive, but not as high as a monopolist. You can also think about it flips for quantity, right? Quantity is kind of, you want to think about maximize under a perfectly competitive market. Maybe I see there's 100 units provided. However, a monopolist restricts output, right? So they might only be producing quantity of 20. Excuse me. Monopolistic competitive market would be somewhere in between. Right? And then as they got more and more market power, that quantity is going to get closer and closer to 20. Yeah.
So is that like Apple?
Apple, so they're one company, they have a lot of products, right? So we actually would have to single it down to one product. So Apple in the phone industry would probably, depends on who you talk to, and we'll get more into these issues a little bit more next week, but probably considered more of an oligopoly market for phones because Apple is like by far and away the biggest, but there's also some other pretty large players, right? Some of the Android phones are a pretty decent percent of the market. But that is the idea, right? That Apple is not quite a monopolist, but they're pretty far away from a perfectly competitive market when it comes to providing phones. It probably wouldn't be 20, if I'm using the numbers here. Apple might be closer to a quantity of 0.5, right? They're pretty close to monopoly, but not quite, right? They can't get away with charging $10,000 for the phone. Otherwise, I think all of us might switch over to Android, right? But yeah, you're thinking about this in the right way. Any other questions at this point? Yeah. And then also you can kind of think about here, deadweight loss is minimized. It's always zero. Under a monopolist, that's where we would see deadweight loss be maximized, unless we had some kind of government regulation. We talked about kind of step in and step pricing. And then, so let's say this was, I don't know, deadweight loss is 2,000 here. Maybe if a monopolist is a competitive market, it's somewhere in between two. Okay? It's just one way to think, I think a different way of thinking about this movement between these different markets. Any questions? We keep going here. So,
see if we're following along. Also, hopefully this is giving us a little bit of an idea about what some of the questions we could see, maybe even graphs
very similar to this on the upcoming exam. If I had a monopolistically competitive market, so I've got my demand curve, my price to seat marginal revenue, the average and total cost and the marginal cost they face, what would the profit maximizing quantity be? Right? So notice here, each of these flat lines, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, which kind of jumps to 2, and then the light gray line in the middle would be kind of jump to 1. So we'll give you guys a little bit of time, talk to people around you. Not as many people here today, so I really like it. Everybody gets these points. But if I'm trying to choose that quantity that maximizes profits, there's one rule that I've said a lot, and it's the same no matter if we're in a perfectly competitive market, a monopoly, or a monopolistically competitive market, when it comes to just choosing the optimal quantity to maximize profits. So I'm not looking for price, we're looking for the output, right? But we're choosing that profit maximizing quantity.
All right. Everybody get their answer in before we close it out here. Everybody good? So I think I counted 29, so should be good. All right.
What rule do we use to determine the optimal quantity for the profit maximizing quantity for a firm? Marginal revenue. I know I hate saying that much too. Marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. The only difference is some of these different markets will face different marginal revenue curves. Well, here we have the marginal revenue curve. It intersects marginal cost at 6 units, right? 4, 6, 8. So the optimal quantity, 6 units or C. Right? Any questions on that?
Hopefully. I'll take a quick look. Hopefully we're, oops. Okay, so we're doing pretty good. All right. So I can get my slides to work there. Oh, well, I already kind of told you this one, right?
So what would the profit corresponding price be that maximizes the profit, right? So I chose the optimal quantity of 6. How do I get to the price of 12? Yeah, so somewhere I just go up to, well, how much are people willing to pay? That's what the demand curve tells me. They'll pay up to their marginal benefit. So at that 6th unit, the marginal benefit consumers, $12, right? Wherever we're at in that demand curve. Okay. What if I ask you instead for, if this was a perfectly competitive market, or it was kind of operating as one, where would the optimal or kind of profit maximizing quantity be?
Would it be your marginal cost of the demand curve, you say?
Yeah, so we said, we think about this perfectly competitive outcome. We basically treat marginal cost as our supply curve, right? Because the supply curve reflects the marginal cost. So if this firm was behaving as though it was in a perfectly competitive, which it wouldn't, but we're just gonna say we want a comparison point. Then if we would choose output out here,
9.
9 units, and the equilibrium price would be 8. So notice, if it was a perfectly competitive market, the price would be lower and the equilibrium quantity would be higher. Just kind of hit some things. What would deadweight loss be if we had a perfectly competitive market here? 0.
Yeah.
Should be like an easy question if I ask you that in the exam. Perfectly competitive market, total surplus is maximized. Deadweight loss is the loss of total surplus. Well, if it's maximized, can't lose it, right? So it's kind of our comparison point, right? We're always starting out there. Now from here, I don't think I have this on the next one. Let's see. I don't think I did, but I want to make this point. How could I calculate deadweight loss? So I'll kind of draw this out on the board so you can kind of think about if I had something like this, and then I'm asking you what would deadweight loss's value be? So you've got what? Our demand curve, marginal revenue, marginal cost. What I have the average cost. So something like this. So we said this quantity was what? 6. Price that we could charge 12. Equilibrium quantity for a perfectly competitive market was 9. I think about this with the monopolistic competitive. Oh, sorry. Perfectly competitive, the monopolistic competitive. Well, I need to find how much surplus was lost. So the difference between my supply and demand curve, the marginal cost representing supply, from this underproduction by the monopolistic competitive market, right? They were producing fewer units. How much surplus did I lose out from each one of those 3 units I no longer sell, right? Well, what's the base of this triangle? We're going from 6 to 9, 3. What would be, so here, base times height times 1/2, right? So what's my height?
8.
So how did you get to that?
Because marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect at 4, so you just take the difference.
Yeah, so what do I need? I need this point, right? In order to get that height of my triangle, I need to figure out where I'm at here. So I go to where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost. That's at $4, or at that profit maximizing quantity, my marginal revenue and marginal cost of that 4th unit are the same thing, or they're 4. Right? So the height of that triangle is 8 times 1. So what? 12. Okay. Any questions over any part of that problem? All right. Liking the response thing. I'm feeling better about us going to this next exam. So, I kind of already mentioned, but so we see this entry and exit until profits kind of get driven down to 0. I can spoil this. I showed you this earlier. But this is what it would look like once we're in the long run. Okay? So even when we're in the long run and profits are 0, there's something that's different about a monopolistically competitive market from a perfectly competitive market. Okay? So we'll notice if I had a perfectly competitive market, I had demand, I had supply, and I said this equilibrium price in the long run, we kind of end up with our profits are equal to 0, and we end up with this minimum point on our average total cost curve. So there, the price is exactly, I think if we go back to the price is the same as the marginal cost, it's the same as the marginal revenue, it's the same as our average total cost in the long run. All right. Everything was kind of hitting right at that same point. Okay? Well, the difference here is now if I look at even when profits are zero, right? Price is equal to average total cost. I now end up with there's a certain markup on every unit, right? That the price is not the same as the marginal cost like it was under a perfectly competitive market. That the price is actually going to be a little bit higher than the marginal cost of that last unit provided. Now profits are still zero, right? But this markup essentially is telling me it's another measure of how inefficient this market is, right? If the market was completely efficient and surplus was maximized, we'd have zero markup, right? That whatever it costs to produce something was exactly what people were charged, right? Here, there's going to be a markup in everything, but how can there be a markup without there being positive profits? You can kind of think about here, people are still going to be paying higher prices. It's just that the competition drives that price down or the profits levels down to zero. So because there is some market power, it does increase the price consumers are going to pay, but there's still competition. Firms are entering and exiting and competing for a similar product. So profits in the long run are still driven to zero, right? So bad for consumers. Really, the producers don't ultimately care. They're making the same profit no matter if it's a perfectly competitive or monopoly competitive market in the long run. Questions on that? It's a kind of a tricky concept. And then another thing that we'll say, I don't have it here, but because you'll also notice we're not at that minimum point on our average total cost curve, which is somewhere kind of above it. We would say that firms are operating with excess capacity, right? They could actually drive their per unit cost down a little bit more if they increase their production a little bit, right? So they've got like excess capacity they're not meeting, right? That's not overly important, but could ask you, I think that might have a homework question related to that. I probably wouldn't focus on that as much on the exam. But kind of this difference between the quantities, just to kind of give a little bit more of a shorthand as opposed to kind of a sentence. This difference is what we would say is the excess capacity, right? That difference between the quantity of the perfectly competitive and monopoly competitive market, that's the excess capacity that exists for that firm. Okay. So here's a side-by-side comparison. Maybe this is a little bit easier than what I have on the board. In the long run, right, for these perfectly competitive markets, we have everything kind of hitting right at that same point. Marginal revenue was constant, right? So marginal revenue with marginal cost is at the minimum point of our average total cost curve. Here, we end up with the price is going to be the same as average total cost. Profit will be zero, but there's going to be a markup, right? Price will be a little bit above the marginal revenue and marginal cost of that last unit provided. And we're seeing a lower quantity than what would put us at the minimum point on our average total cost curve. So we said we had this excess capacity as well. Right? We have capacity that we weren't using. Any questions we can move in here? So kind of think about that's the efficient point. We kind of compare the prices. We've already kind of we've looked at this already, right? The price is a little bit lower in the competitive market. Quantity is also going to be a little bit higher under that perfectly competitive market. Price is above average total cost, so this is our markup. So, what is true about the long run equilibrium for all firms in a long run, or sorry, in a monopolistic competitive market? So, just want to get an idea of kind of where we're at here. Just kind of talk to people around you. Try to look at this and give you a little bit of time to work on this, and we'll think about it. So, maybe drawing it out and having that all over there might help you think about the relationship between price, marginal costs, and where the minimum point in your average total cost curve is. And marginal revenue. Maybe breaking this down into kind of each relationship might make it a little bit easier.
I think a lot of people are all kind of confused right now.
They're all kind of confused. So all I'm trying to ask you to do is we have this monopolistic competitive market. We can identify the profit maximizing quantity and price. So I'm just asking about the relationship between the different things in this graph, right? So we said already, price is gonna be what relative to marginal cost? Well, what are my marginal costs at that profit maximizing quantity? 4, right? The point I'm at my marginal cost group is 4. What's the price that I'm gonna set? 12. So what's the relationship between price and marginal cost there? At that profit maximizing quantity, price is greater than marginal cost. Right? What's the marginal revenue at that optimal quantity? Well, if I'm choosing the optimal quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, hopefully it's also 4, right? The point that I'm at in my marginal revenue curve is also 4. So price is also greater than marginal revenue. Now we said, and I kind of have in the previous one, maybe not as clear on the visual I have up here, but you can draw yourself and see, okay, if I had the profits being equal to 0, we said that there was always going to be that minimum point in my average total cost curve. We only hit that point if we were in a perfectly competitive market. So, the other visuals, I think it makes it a little bit easier to see. But if we had a long run equilibrium here, that minimum point on my average total cost curve, if I operate as a monopolistic competitive firm, I'm going to be at a price that's above that minimum point on my average total cost curve, right? In a perfectly competitive market, price will be exactly equal to the minimum point on the average total cost curve, right? So I haven't lowered my per unit cost as much as I could have because I'm trying to maximize profits, right? But for society, it'd be better if I kind of move output out to get to that minimum point on my average total cost curve. So that per unit cost was as low as possible. So here we think about all the things that we've said. The first one is marginal revenue less than marginal cost. There's no way. We chose the optimal quantity when those two things are equal to each other. Right? So that doesn't make any sense. Price is going to be the same as marginal revenue and marginal cost. That's for a perfectly competitive market. Yeah. So B would be what's true if we had a perfectly competitive market. We already said here that price is above marginal cost. So throw that one out. Price is going to be equal to average total cost in the long run. Okay, that could be true because we have 0 profits in the long run. Price is above marginal cost. We said that was true. And then we also said price was above that minimum point of my average total cost. So C looks like it's the right answer. I haven't closed it out, so hopefully everybody's getting this one. Why did we rule D out? What doesn't make any sense there? Well, yeah, both of them don't make sense, right? First of all, price has to be above marginal cost, but also in the long run, if profits are 0, price should be equal to average cost. Does that kind of help the discussion a little bit? Any questions on anything there? So we'll close that one out. So we got all 29 people in. I'm afraid. All right, you guys are killing it today. So, I mean, look, I've done it before, and people don't get it right even when I tell them their answer. So, there we go. All right. So, if we can kind of think about some of the reasons why we don't like these monopoly competitive markets. We've got excess capacity. We haven't lowered per unit cost as much as we could have. We don't end up on this long run kind of minimum point or average total cost curve. We also, I have already pointed this out, the price is going to be above what it costs to produce that unit, right? Which then means in the competitive market, price is exactly equal to that marginal cost, so consumers are better off. So the dead weight loss, just like a monopolist, really a lot of this dead weight loss is going to be coming more from consumers than it is from producers, right? And that producers in these markets are going to convert some of consumer surplus into producer surplus, right? So we don't like these markets. Oh, let's skip ahead here. No, we don't have that luck on this. I'll manage this. We'll probably revisit this next week. So just to give some practical application, because we went through a lot of like theory and kind of understand this. Where do we see this play out? Is really as an advertising, right? So why do firms advertise? So why do firms advertise? right? Well, what they're trying to do is convince you that their product is different, right? And if I can differentiate my product and take a higher portion of the overall demand, then I can kind of increase my demand curve for my product, pushing that up so I can potentially get positive profits, right? So if I'm the one that's advertising the most, I'm hopefully get that is productive advertising. I'm gonna steal more of demand, able to have a larger markup than the other firms in that industry, increase my profits, and unless they start spending more on advertising or more firms enter that market, I might be able to, in the short run, kind of experience these positive profits, right? So we'll kind of talk about some of the benefits of advertising through the lens of an option competitive market, and then we'll kind of talk about maybe why it's not efficient as well. And then we'll move to oligopolies on Monday, finish them up on Wednesday, do a review Friday. Okay? All right, you guys have a fun, safe weekend. I will see you on Monday.